Good evening, everyone. Happy weekends and welcome to today's class. So we have just 12 people in class, so we are just going to give 5 more minutes for others to join. Please remember when you come in, write your name on the chat box and your party. Thank you very much. So see you guys in 5 more minutes. Okay, good evening once again. This is 17:05 and it's time for class. So party chairman, please message all your members that it's time for class and facilitator is already here. So I'm just going to give a brief intro of the facilitator for today's class, Dr. Toby Oluwatola. Dr. Toby Oluwatola is the Executive Director of the Center for Journalism Innovation and Development, CJID, a media innovation think and do tank with a mission to enable a media that promotes the values of democracy in Africa. CJID owns and operates a range of media platforms, including Premium Times, an investigative journalism platform, Dubawa, a fact checker, pressattack.ng, leaks.ng, campusreporter.ng, Gossip app, among others. Dr. Oluwatola started his career in 2006 as a management consultant, but has since worked as a presidential campaign manager, a policy consultant in 4 continents, and an energy entrepreneur. He's also currently the founder/board chairman of the Madiba Foundation for Good Governance and the founder/CEO of Tao Energy. He's enthusiastic/Albert terrible golfer, a competent board card game player, and a happiness hacker. You can ask him offline. So we have Dr. Toby present this evening, and he'll be taking us on media in democracy. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Is that Lisa or Wumi?
That's Charlie, actually. That's Charlie.
Oh.
Good day, sir. Good day, sir. It's always a privilege to have you on the game, and I'm always there. So my Oga, it's an honor for the college to have you.
The privilege is certainly mine, and my apologies for the delay in getting this class in joining and getting started. Right now, I'm joining on my phone because for some reason my computer is refusing to connect to the internet. But I think with Talia's help, controlling the slides, we should be fine if this doesn't work out in due course. Okay, looks like it's getting on now. So if you just give me a few moments, let me connect properly with my laptop so that I can control my own slides. If you could just all indulge me for another 2 minutes. We start at 5:10, please. Okay. Can everyone hear me clear?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm struggling to hear a little bit. Let's make sure all the headphones work.
Also.
Okay. So let's find the slides, share screen, share PowerPoint, share. Okay. All right. Good afternoon again, people. And thank you so much for the opportunity to the Electoral College and my big brother and colleague, Kunle Lawal, and the rest of the very competent team at Electoral College. So the title of this session is Media in Democracy, and what we hope to achieve with this class is two things really. One is to help participants gain an appreciation of the role that media ought to play in democracy, and to also then go from there to see the reasons why, or the structural reasons why it's difficult for media in many cases to play that role in society, such that we can sort of bridge that gap between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. And finally, to then see how you and I can utilize the media effectively, particularly if you're trying to run for political office at some point. You're going to need the media, and how do you leverage that effectively towards your democratic goals? So those are some of the things that we'll be looking at today. So I'll start the session with a quote by one of the founding fathers of America's democracy, Thomas Jefferson, where he said that, were it to be left to him to decide whether to have a government without newspapers or with newspapers without a government, he would not hesitate to prefer the latter, meaning he would rather have newspapers without a government than have a government without newspapers. But that should mean that every man should be able to receive the papers and be able to read them. And this really represents the sentiment of a lot of the people who sort of crafted some of the early democracies, whether you're talking about the American democracy or you're talking about the Athenian democracy and the Roman Republic, were mostly oligarchies, as it were, and there was circulation of information within the oligarchies. But then once you advance further into just after the Dark Ages, you had the democracies that evolved in the Scandinavians, and all of them had sort of this ethic of making sure that that people had access to information. And that was sort of the Protestant ethic that also underpinned the American democracy at origins. And it continues to be true today, because people need to be informed appropriately for them to make correct decisions about self-government. And another quote I like to use is from Nelson Mandela, when he was talking to the Press Council of Cape Town, where he said, a critical and independent and investigative press is the lifeblood of any democracy. And he also said something that, or to the extent that newspapers are not just the watchdog for democracy, they are the very essence of democracy, and they are the builders and the shapers of democracy. So it's important that newspapers or the media play that role. And again, if we take that out of the democratic lingo and we go into political speak, when you think about political theory really identifies three different elements of a democratic society. So there's the individuals and markets, where people have their private autonomy, and everyone pursues their own individual objectives. If you're a fan of Adam Smith, you'd quickly say that, oh yes, let's everyone should be selfish and pursue their goals, and capitalism, let's all pursue our individual goals. But anyone who is a thoughtful observer would realize that if everyone is just pursuing their own individual goals, there will be times where their individual goals come to conflict. And when their individual goals come to conflict, there will be fights. And when there is fights, there will be anarchy if there's no order, which is why, some of the, again, original thinkers around democracy, Thomas Hobbes in his book Leviathan talks about the fact that any government, whether it is a bad government or a good government or a tyrannical government is better than no government at all, and so the state is important, and the state is what really helps define the rules around which we can moderate. Individuals and markets have to moderate their behaviors in a society, in a democratic society. But if you then have a case where, the state is all powerful, then there's a third leg, which is the community and the people. Because if you have a case where, markets and individuals are very powerful, then you have some sort of an oligarchy. If you have a state where, where the state is all powerful and then the community and markets are silenced, you have an autocracy. But then if you have, community be extremely strong and states and markets are not working, you have anarchy. So you really have to have all three be strong. And the media is really what gives voice, it creates that interface between all three legs of functioning societies. So if you look critically at the societies that are most egalitarian, the fairest societies in the world, if you let me use that word, they also have the freest and the media that you would find. So countries like Norway, Sweden, Luxembourg, they also have the freest media you will find. So those three elements sort of have to balance each other out for you to have a well-functioning democratic society. And the way in which sort of the media does that, and I call this the ontology of media and democracy, is really defined in three roles. The first role is that of a watchdog. And I think that's the one that most people who are familiar with the investigative journalism, which few outlets in Nigeria are known for, is that your job is to really scrutinize the government and to make sure you keep people on their toes. My Oga, we do this well, just being a very effective watchdog, providing principled resistance to people who want to subvert democratic processes. But then there is also the role of gatekeeper of the public sphere. Now, this second role is a lot less a role of the traditional media that the traditional media is able to effectively play today, because of the onslaught of social media and new ways that people get their information. So in the past, a newspaper editor could decide, people will know what people will not know. A TV producer could determine what gets in the news at 9 and what doesn't get into the news at 9. However, today, the newspaper editor as well as the news producer are struggling to catch up with the information that has already gone viral and billions of people have already seen on social media. So clearly, that traditional role of being gatekeeper of the public sphere is severely challenged. And but the problem with that challenge is that you then have a question of who do you trust? And a lot of people will argue that in any case, we can't trust traditional media themselves because they're typically for-profits themselves. So typically they are owned by, they're owned by politicians, or they're owned by political interest groups. So whether it be Fox News, that is, you could also argue that we can't trust even traditional media themselves. However, you've also got the difference between social media and people who just post on social media and people who have to go through the journalistic process is really that of professionalism and the ethics on which the profession is founded. The ethics of fairness, of accuracy, of fact checking, or ethics of balance, and ethics of humanity, on which people who practice journalism correctly really have to go through before any story gets out. So in the end, I think we're still better off as if having well-trained professionals being the gatekeepers of the public sphere and what does get out in the public sphere. Now we had just some random Joe who's just trying to get likes on TikTok or social media or Facebook or what have you. So that's one role that the media plays, and if when it works well, the media also help tackle information disorder, misinformation, which is when your grandmother basically posts something that was forwarded to her on a church WhatsApp group. That's misinformation because she didn't know that it was not true. Disinformation speaks to when there is an organized, deliberate process to misinform. So we saw a lot of this, or we see a lot of these around elections. Anytime there's an election, there are taps for disinformation. Just this last election in Nigeria, we did a study at CGID that showed that of all the followers that started following the candidates after they got the tickets of their parties, more than 60% of the new followers that they earned were bots. And those bots were very active in the last days of the election, basically tweeting whatever would discredit the other party for the most part, to a significant degree, maybe not for the most part, to a significant degree, the information they tweet, they retweet, and they popularize being false information, or at least what you might call malinformation. So malinformation really speaks to truthful information, or information which may be true, but is propagated with the intent to cause harm. And this will be an example of this would be revenge porn. So if someone, by virtue of their proximity to you, maybe you're dating someone, they get angry, they go put that information out there. That's malinformation. So the idea should be that the media plays a role in gatekeeping such things. So ideally, technology companies should have rules around what can be posted, what cannot be posted on their platforms, and really content moderates to that regard. Obviously, there is the trade-off of there's always going to be the trade-off of who becomes the judge, right? Who becomes the judge of what gets seen, who becomes the judge of free speech. But the reality is that there's always going to be a trade-off between freedom and security. There's always a trade-off. And the more freedom you have, the less security you have. It's just the nature of life. And if we allow all freedoms, then it will create anarchy. So there needs to be gatekeepers to the public sphere, least of all because there are people who, they're young people and things like that, and children and things like that who are exposed to the public sphere. There needs to be some gatekeeping. And then the last role, which I find the most exciting, is the agenda setter role. And this is the role I find the most exciting, because it's the role of educating, informing, and entertaining citizens. It's the role of deciding, or rather, maybe not deciding, but unearthing what ought to be in the media space, what ought to be the news, what government ought to be doing. Because it's in this role that we really make the lives of the people better. It's in this role that even if there is a community that is being flooded, in that is at risk of being submerged in some remote village that politicians will probably not see, it is the job of the media to make that the agenda, to make that the issue that politicians have to worry about. If there are people who are dying of a preventable disease somewhere, it is the job of the media to make that the agenda, to make it the thing that has to be talked about. And that's the role, I personally find the most exciting. It's also the role of the media to really, put politicians to the task when we say that we want to run for political office, and to make sure that the citizens get detailed information that they need on the people that are going to represent them. Kunle likes to talk a lot about the different roles and the jobs of different political office holders. It is the job of the media, to really question people who want to go be our legislators. What are you going to legislate? Don't tell me you will build a borehole in your village. A borehole in your village is not your job. What laws are you passionate about that you want to go enact? What disadvantages structurally do your people face in your constituency that you want to go address by going to represent them? So that setting the agenda and making sure that it's the one that advances the interests of the people is the important job of media as well. So just moving forward real quick, and this is really embedded in, the constitutions, whether you're in international treaty. So these roles that I speak of and these functions of media and democracy that I speak of, they're not things that I pulled out of my head. I pulled out of my behind. They are things that are ingrained not just in international treaties, so from the UN Human Rights Declaration to the ECOWAS Treaty to the Arab Charter of Human Rights, the role of the media is clearly stated in there. To the statutes and constitutions of Nigeria, Section 22 of Nigerian Constitution, and across West Africa in Ghana, Section 126, 162, Sierra Leone, Section 11, and so on and so forth. Everywhere, it's a law that the media plays that role. And also in case law, you had the case of Tony Momo versus National Assembly, where even Nigeria's legal system established, the role of the media in democracy and how the judiciary or the National Assembly in this case couldn't legislate against the role of the media. So I think this slide really just gives some historical context. I will run through it very quickly, not to bore anyone in the room. Newspapers emerged in Nigeria around 1859, with the first one being the West African Pilot, I believe it was called, in 1859, and the first wire service started in 76. And the transition to digital, which is what we mostly live in today, started in 1995, which has really revolutionized how we receive media today. The first VSAT was installed in OAU campus in 96, and so on and so forth. Today, so I also have here that 234 Next, first online newspaper was around 1996. 234 Next in 2009 was perhaps the first, really first hyperlinked searchable streaming video news platform online in the country. Today, almost every news platform, what it solves is streamed online in some way or another, both in video and text and audio. So that's something of the evolution. And today we've got, close to 201, government-owned TV stations, about 43, privately owned TV stations, 185 government-owned radio stations. And that's a problem, if I'm being honest, if there are that many government-owned TV stations and radio stations. And we'll get to that in a bit. And even the private ownership too has its own killing, but we'll talk about that in a bit. About 27 campus broadcast stations and hundreds of digital news sites and blogs. About over 150 million Nigerians on the internet. Active social media usage. I think this information may be a little dated now. It's from January of last year. We had about 90 million people on WhatsApp, about 26 million people on Facebook, and so on and so forth. And there's this data that I found very interesting, and I don't know if the people in the room have seen it, which really speaks to it from a Statista study, also from sometime last year, that showed that compared to the rest of the world, Nigerians spend more time on social media, an average of 4.2 hours per day on social media, compared to the next being Philippines, and so on and so forth. And that really exposes us to a lot more content on social media, and many people even get to the news through social media. So you go on Twitter, you see a piece of news that is trending, you click on the link to go to Premium Times to go read it there. But you typically will start on social media. So moving on to the second aspect, of this study, of this conversation, which is, the challenges to media being effective in sort of playing those roles that we highlighted, that are essentially constitutional roles that they ought to play. And I've classified these into two categories. There are the ones I call endogenous, which are things that the media inflicts on itself. And they're the ones I call exogenous, which are really things that are external to the media itself that they are battling against. So in terms of the endogenous ones, obviously there are lots of ethical and professional lapses. So the values on which the profession is founded of truth and accuracy, independence, fairness, impartiality, humanity, accountability, you will be sometimes hard pressed, to find 6 out of 10 journalists that abide by those rules, by those ethical standards, which is what it is, especially because of the prebendal nature of the society we live in, the poverty in the society. It's hard for you to tell someone, a reporter whose newsroom pays 50K a month, and tells them, hey, go cover events and collect envelopes from the event. So it's hard to tell them not to be biased when they're collecting envelopes from events and they're covering government events, and government is telling them, hey, this is how to tell the story. Here's money to go tell that story in that way. So it's the reality of the environments in which we live in, and the question is, should that be the case? Is there a way, and I'll get to this when I get to the exogenous factors. And the second one is capacity. There's simply underdeveloped technical capacity, whether in investigative reporting or digital reporting capabilities. If anyone ever, our organization has an outreach called Campus Reporter, where we go into various universities to teach them the basics of journalism and to sort of remediate the capacity gaps that we find in the people who graduates in mass comm programs and whatnot. And what we find is that the quality of the curriculum, the quality of the teachers themselves that teach these people, and it's true of every profession really in Nigeria today, the quality of what comes out of our universities is really abysmal. So there's a capacity issue, and there's what I call weak editorial independence and pluralism. So weak editorial independence really speaks to whether or not the people who write and produce the news have the freedom to write what it is they believe to be true, or they have to write what their bosses dictate that they write. And you and I will agree that it's oftentimes the case that editorial independence is questionable. I think that there are newsrooms in Nigeria today. There are many more than there used to be, and we also have to give Nigeria some credit. Editorial independence is a lot better in Nigeria than it is in most of our African counterparts, in terms of how much freedom that reporters have to say what they believe to be true. But you've also got the challenge of pluralism. Pluralism really speaks to who owns the media houses, because ultimately it is really hard, even if my boss tells me, hey, go say what you believe to be true. It is really hard for me to go up there on TV and say what I know my boss flatly disagrees with. Even I have experienced that, where I had to go speak on behalf of the organization, and I know that my boss disagrees with something, with a view I hold. It is hard for me to express that view very strongly. So it's just the reality of life, and the way you deal with that, that is to make sure that there is a diverse set of people who own media. So if everyone who owns media in the country is a man, the views that you will see will always be tilted towards men. If everyone who owns media in a country are Yoruba from Lagos, which is largely the case, in Nigeria, you would find that, or rather was largely the case, particularly in the 90s. It is less the case today, but in the 90s, it was largely the case. So you had a whole generation of people, 80s and 90s, that were raised on that Yoruba media dominance, that really formed from the way people formed the way people thought about things in Nigeria at the time. So it's important that there be pluralism, and that's what I'm speaking to. And in terms of the exogenous ones, there is definitely the challenge of the new digital media space, social media, as well as artificial intelligence that essentially threatens to replace all of knowledge work as we know it, and the resulting information disorder challenges. Remember, when I defined information disorder earlier, it is what people colloquially call fake news, right? So that's what I mean. And then there is the relentless suppression of the press by increasingly authoritarian regimes. I think that the Buhari regime, in many cases, it took us back a few steps in where press freedom is concerned in Nigeria. Certainly not as bad as places like Mali or Burkina Faso or Guinea, where there were coups or military autocrats, but it certainly took us back a few steps, with a lot of people just being arrested on trumped-up charges and held. Just around the elections, one of my friends, Haruna, was who publishes the newspaper Wiki Times, was arrested and held for close to 2 weeks or so for something he wrote, for just reporting a story around a politician was campaigning. Some women around the campaign were complaining, and he just went to listen to them and documented what they said. And he spent weeks in jail for that. so you still have that happening often and often. There's a story of Agba Jalingo, who basically just wrote a story about some arms deal, and some arms deal gone wrong, and he ended up spending 2 years in jail before he finally got. So we still have those cases, and then there's the ineffectual business models that lead to a sustainability challenge. What I'm really saying is that the media doesn't have money. Many times the people who produce news don't have money. And that goes back to the issue I started with, which is that those ethical and professional lapses. Because how do you tell someone, who started a business not to be unethical, when the only way to pay salaries is to basically go cover an event for government and get a big bumper paycheck, because advertisers are no longer advertising or paying as much. They're now all advertising on Facebook and Google, where they can get more concrete data on the effectiveness of their advertising. So you've got business models that are sort of failing. I remember very, very vividly when 234 Next, at the time when I was involved with the Badu campaign, there were a bunch of people who, colleagues who worked at 234 Next at the time, and they had written a story about Desiani, and how they were called out. They had done an investigation about how there was a massive grand corruption at NNPC, championed by Desiani. And the story was, and the government of the time, Jonathan government of the time, basically just told all businesses that if you advertise with these guys, we close all government accounts with you. So all the banks, one by one, left. The airlines, the telecoms companies, MTN, all of them stopped advertising. Everybody stopped advertising because everybody was afraid of what the government might do to them. And it didn't take long before that business, that newspaper shut down. And a lot of people that were produced by that newspaper are now the people who are leading various things around the world now, various things now. So people like Red Media, people like Premium Times, people like Cable, all of them sort of had their foundations. Everybody had a stint, 234 Next or the other, but that particular entity died because of a failed business. So these are challenges that the media faces. And the point that we make is that because of these challenges, there would always be below journalism, but not all media is like that. There is also the tradition of democratic and anti-corruption motion in the media that still, at the core, really still presents the media, traditional media, as perhaps, especially when the judiciary itself is corrupted or corruptible. The media is in the end the last hope of the people, the common man, as it were. So yeah, and we've got to do what we can to help it survive. About the challenge of misinformation and disinformation before. The media plays a role in fact-checking, in providing media literacy, because I think it's important that people really understand how to discern for themselves what is correct news and what is fake news. And I think technology companies also have a big role to play where that is concerned, in making sure that people get access to the truth and not just and not fake news, And I ask a question there where I really say, does everyone have rights to distribution? So yes, everyone has rights to free speech, but the question is, does everyone have rights to distribution? And that's really the question that tech companies have to ask. Where content moderation is concerned. And to the question of who should judge, I think many times many times algorithms can do the job, but also algorithms are often biased. So it's often important that humans who are trained also help support algorithms in terms of who should do the job of content moderation. And so we have a few technology companies working with our own organization and organizations like us, like Africa Check, like Dubawa and whatnot, to help with fact checking to some degree. But tech companies really could do a lot more, because ultimately we find that to a large degree they're more incentivized by what makes them money, and stuff that goes viral easily makes them money, and they tend to allow those to fly very, very often, which is, something that we keep having to talk with tech companies about. You won't solve all the problems overnight, but hopefully we keep making small progress. And that therein also lies some of the questions that came up in the last administration when the NITA came up with this NITA code. Everybody, everybody went up in arms about, oh, NITA, you want to go through the back door and issue social media bill and whatnot. But in the end, we've got to also recognize that there are elements of, the code that we need, because if you look throughout Europe is really doing a lot of work in really helping sort of write rules for technology companies, and no single company should have that much power, ultimate power, and that's why that takes us back to that thing that we talked about, those three roles we talked about, where we said market, states, and the people and the community. The state at many times ought to do the job of moderating the markets. When the markets when individuals in the market start to have too much market power. Who should be the judge? I think it should be a democratic process. Who should be the judge? And no single individual or company should be able to decide, what people see and what people cannot see. So how do we move forward? And one of the things I'd like to stress here is that how do we move forward? How do we make sure that the press is a little freer, and how do we make sure that we have a slightly empower the press to do the job that they ought to do a little bit better? And I think that a lot of it has to start with the laws, has to start with the legal backing that they have to do the work that they have to do. So right now, as we speak, there are at least 13 laws that constrain press freedom in some way in Nigeria. One is the Anti-Terrorism Act. That was the act on which Agba Jalingo was sent to jail for 2 years. There is the Cyber Crimes Act. We saw after NSAS, we saw a lot of people arrested under the Cyber Crimes Act. There is the NBC Act. And I'll just talk about the NBC Act a little bit. The challenge with the NBC Act is that the NBC is supposed to be a neutral body. But when you create a neutral arbiter for the press or for the broadcast media, and you then say that it reports to the Minister for Information and Communication, at the time in the person of Mr. Lai Mohammed, and then, Mr. Lai can basically just say that, he can fire and hire who gets to lead the organization. He can do whatever he wants. Then in the essence, you don't have an independent arbiter. What you have is an attack dog. And oftentimes, what happened with the NBC in that government was that, the press was just attacked. Without anybody being able to moderate or be an independent assessor of whether or not the government was right in its attack. So that obviously needs to be fixed. And my interaction with the folks at the commission is that they're very decent professionals, but if you put a decent professional in a place where it is, silver or lead, it will pick silver over lead any day, anytime. So and that's really what we're speaking of here. And there are a bunch of other laws like that: Criminal Crimes Act, the Official Secrets Act, the Obscene Publications Act. And the thing I also stress here is that it's the nature of power to be to corrupt even the best of us. And going back to my guy Lai Mohammed, I recall when he was in the opposition, he was the biggest advocate of press freedom and the biggest advocate of freedom of speech. But the minute he had power, he became the tyrant that he decried. And it's not just him. It's not because he's a black man. Because once things happen in Africa, people say, "Oh, it's black man's problem. It's black man's this." No, it's everybody. Even someone as noble as Martin Luther, who really drove the Protestant Reformation and really established that right of every man to the information and to the Bible and to whatever. When he himself had power, he suppressed information and suppressed other sects, other religious sects that he disagreed with. And the same is true of Ben Franklin, so one of the big fathers of America's democracy, and the big genius that Ben Franklin was. It was one of the guys who really wrote the papers that really brought down the monarchy. But when he himself became, a founding father, he himself became a suppressor. So in the end, the power will corrupt anybody. You need laws to restrain power, which is why, even, whether or not you supported this current administration, eventually they are also going to find themselves in places where, they're going to suppress the press. So in the end, you've got to have laws that restrain people from doing that. Even after you have the laws, people will still walk around the laws. But the first thing, let's have the laws first. Let's have, the right enabling environment first. So moving on from there is to talk about, the second challenge, where I talk about the exogenous challenges. So the first one being the onslaught of new media and how you tackle it. How do you tackle disinformation? The second being press on freedom. How do you tackle that? The third exogenous challenge is the challenge of received business models that have failed, and this is where there needs to be innovation a little bit to really make the media more sustainable. In many countries of the world, private. I stress here that private ownership of the media does not always guarantee against media capture. We've seen cases where private ownership can actually be worse. And I gave the example of Fox News and CNN before. Let us not talk about The Nation paper or Daily Trust or what have you, that really lean towards their owners. The point here is that who should own media and how should media be run? And I like to point out examples in places like, again, Scandinavia and even in the UK, where the BBC is a government entity, but it's a government entity that is operated by a direct funding that comes from the people, that comes from public service levies that people pay. Everybody pays it. It sums up to close to £5 billion. And that's the money that runs the BBC. So the BBC can write stories on everything and anything, without any fear because their funding is already guaranteed in the law. It's already guaranteed in the law. And the same is true of the media in most of Scandinavia and places where people are free. So that's just an example of a way to fund the media. Another is to make sure that is to find ways that reader revenues, that business models that integrate readers into the funding of the media. And a lot of people are innovating with membership and subscription models today. And we happen to believe that, the more people you have that are funding you is always better than having few people funding you. And that seems to be the direction that media innovation will take. So I haven't talked about the challenges of the media and some of the ways in which certain media houses are trying to tackle them. I now want to talk a little bit about, some tips about how to work effectively with media. If you are trying to run for office, or you are in a place where you feel like you need a little more media exposure. And again, this, you won't get everything in this conversation. This thing is progressive. So one is, it's important to develop relationships with key editors, reporters, and bloggers. And I cannot stress this enough. In the end, people post things that their friends send them. So if I'm able to, if it's important to me that I have good perception or good representation in the media, it's important to develop relationships with these guys, because ultimately, they're human beings like you and I. They post things that their friends send to them. And it's important to stay in touch, find opportunities to engage. Do you have an event that you're organizing? Invite that media person that you know. Find ways to keep in touch. Understand what is newsworthy. Not everything is newsworthy. And not everything will be newsworthy the way that you want it to be newsworthy, because sometimes people send me stuff or send us stuff that, we look at it and I'm like, if we put this one online, if we put this one on Premium Times or whatever, and they are not paying us for it, we can't do that, because other people will pay us to put this up online, because it's too self-congratulatory. It's not telling a news story. It's basically just PR. It's public relations. So you've got to understand what is newsworthy and be able to, craft what you're trying to say in a way that is newsworthy. Obviously, understanding limits and needs of the media. There are times when, I cannot stress enough how many times we've had our reporters have said they had situations where, they're trying to talk to some politician, is not responding to get information on something, but then the minute that he then has a scandal and he then has a problem, he's chasing you all over the place, calling you at 2 a.m., so when the time to build a relationship is before you need it. So it's important to respond to calls quickly. It's important to address problems and move on. What I mean here is oftentimes you will have bad press about you. It's very important that you set the record straight. Oftentimes people feel like, and I think one person that I thought typified this well in politics, and I don't think she's a saint by any stretch, is Hadissa Bala Mohammed. There was a lot of bad press about her, sponsored by our heart enemy, the Minister for Transport at the time. But before the thing is coming out, she's already written a side of the story. And at every point in time, she always just writes a side of the story, I don't think she's pure either. But the fact that she was always, proactive in responding makes everybody now think that the other guy is the bad guy and not her. So it's important to address problems very quickly and move on. provide reporters with information in a format they can use. I talked about that already, but I also mean that very literally, that many times reporters tend to be lazy, if I'm being honest. So if you're inviting a reporter to something, write the text for them that you want them to use. They may not use it. The good ones will not use what you write for them. But the truth is that there are more bad ones than there are good ones. So the good ones will not use it. The good ones will rewrite it. But if there is one good one and there are 6 bad ones, better that you make sure that the 6 bad ones write it in exactly the way you want them to write it. I've had many instances where we had a funder fund an event, and then the media reported it, and then they reported it wrong, or they missed the funder's name, or they missed an important detail, and then the funder is coming back to me and getting angry, and I'm like, that's not a mistake we should be making, So it's important that you give people the information you want them to publish in the words you want them to use. Let them go change it if they want. It's important to anticipate media's needs for content. I always find it very interesting when people reach out to me and say, hey, there's this story I think is worth telling. Do you mind sending a reporter to look at it? We quite frankly appreciate his work that you're giving us, but oftentimes we find it very helpful. Even if we won't write the story, even if we won't follow this, just the fact that you took the initiative when you saw the opportunity to pick up the phone and call a media person to say, hey, is this a story worth telling? That's one way to keep a relationship going. So and then the last thing I want to say is, and I said this before, but I just want to reiterate it a little bit, is that draft your releases like a story, not an advertisement, and understand the hero's journey. And what is the hero's journey? So the hero's journey, for those who don't know, really speaks to, if you've ever watched any movie in your life, or rather very influential movies, they tend to have a plot line that is similar. And that plot line really typically follows this trajectory where there is a hero whose context is defined, is going through some challenges. Maybe if you look at Karate Kid, for example, fellow kids in school are bullying him. He's just moved into a new state, new city. The kids are bullying him in school. He cannot fight. They're always beating him. And then, so he's going through challenges. And then he meets a helper, a mentor. He meets Mr. Miyagi, who teaches him, karate. And then he goes back, goes through a few struggles and hard times, and finally overcomes his challenges because of his perseverance and whatnot. And if you almost go through, pretty much any movie, you would find that elements of that plot line. Maybe they toss in some love, they toss in some romance, they toss in some other things into it. But ultimately, it typically follows that plot line because we all want to root for someone. And it's important when you tell your story that you don't position yourself as the hero. Once you position yourself as the hero, it looks like you're advertising. But when you position yourself as the helper, and you frame yourself in the story you are telling as the helper and the people as the hero, then it reads like news rather than advertisement. I'll say that again. When you write your stories, more often than not, position yourself as the helper rather than the hero. Let other people be the ones to position you as the hero. When you write it, position yourself as the helper and the people as the hero. And that way, people can read it and find it, your story to be more of an inspirational story than it is an advertisement. So I'll stop on that note. take any questions you may have on anything we've discussed today. So we started out by talking about the role of media in democracy. We talked about the challenges of media in democracy, and we highlighted 3 key challenges, or 2 categories of challenges: the endogenous challenges and the exogenous challenges. We highlighted 3 exogenous challenges: press freedom being an issue, money in media being an issue, and disinformation being an issue. And then we talked about how the media is working to solve those challenges and how you can help the media solve those challenges. And then we talked about a few tips for engaging the media. At this point, I'll keep quiet. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will take any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. That was a very insightful class. I also learned a lot, and getting key information is very important in our daily aspect of life, because we have different news flying around and you won't know which is which. You just take the news and then land in and that trouble that you won't understand yourself. Thank you very much, sir, for that. So we are now going to give room for questions. If you have questions, you can raise up your hands or drop your questions on the chat box. Amadine, I've asked you to unmute.
All right. Good evening. Can you hear me?
Good evening.
Good evening. Yeah, thank you so much for the lecture. I'm actually a broadcast journalist, and so thank you very much. I learned a lot. So I wanted to ask about I think you call something malinformation, and I don't know if this scenario counts as that, where journalists are told to sort of consider the situation and understand that it's not all information you have access to that you should share, so to speak. But, so I'm wondering, is that something that you should really have the power over? Take, for instance, you found news that is damaging, perhaps an example I normally hear of is the military. You find news that is not the best about the Nigerian military, and people say you're supposed to consider, what the report or the news could do to the morale of the military and so on, and be patriotic and not run with that story. So I'm wondering what the alternative is. Is it that when you found out this thing, you just say, well, if I let it out, there will be mayhem, so I just keep it and I'll just mind my business? Or what do you now do when you have decided perhaps that this news will cause more harm if it's out than good? So what do you do with said report? And then on the other hand, you mentioned CNN and Fox and all that, and I believe the executive director of the Electoral College in the last class he gave made a statement, just an off-hand statement, but that I took note of, where he said a populist media house or a populist is not the same as a popular one. It's different. So I'm wondering, to what extent should journalists be able to do that in terms of, in my mind, if I know something is a certain way and I believe this is how it is, but I have to be neutral or objective and so on, do I just, always stay in the middle, never, fully expressing myself? There's some media houses, I won't mention name, but some people look at them and they say, these people, they're always complaining, they're anti-government, they never want to hear good things about the government, they just want to criticize. And someone might ask, what if that is the reality of the journalist truly? As a journalist, this removal of fuel subsidy affected me like everyone else. So if I'm constantly going through terrible impact of decisions made by the government, do I have that duty to be quiet or to be objective and say, you know what, yes, the government has affected lives of Nigerians, but let's look at it like this? I don't know. I just want to know, to what extent is it allowed to be that far left, far right, or ethically you just have to be in the middle or something? So those are my questions. Thank you.
those are two phenomenal questions, and you asked they're very, very good questions. I'll start with the first one. So your first question is the duty of care that journalists have, and to what extent do you have a duty of care to the society? So the short answer to that question is that that is why journalism is not an individual sport. It's a team sport. It's a team sport in the sense that every newsroom ought to have what they call an editorial board that, especially when things get sensitive, adjudicates on what gets out and what we need to exercise our duty of care, where we need to exercise our duty of care. Because the truth is that there are certain things that you will report that have national security implications, and you need to be circumspect in those respects. And that's why journalism is not the same thing as social media, where I can just pick one information and I just run with it. I've also got to be humane. Part of the ethical professional standards is humanity. And humanity speaks to this thing I want to run with. How does it impact the humanity of someone else? Say, for example, I find porn about someone. Is that something I should run with? And the principle is really the principle of doing no harm, or doing minimal harm. What do I mean by doing no harm? And the fathers of I believe it's John Stuart Mill, who's sort of the intellectual. There's probably a Yoruba person or an Igbo person who came up with a theory of this before John Stuart Mill. But John Stuart Mill is the one that we all refer to when we talk about theory of freedom. And in his theory of freedom, he speaks about freedom of speech. Essentially goes to the extent that you do no harm to someone else. Once your freedom of speech starts to do harm, then it needs to be curtailed. Freedom of speech is not absolute. It shouldn't be absolute. Any freedom shouldn't be absolute. And this is where editorial boards ought to come in, because there are particularly sensitive things that a journalist finds that you've got to bring wise people together. So editorial board really, and most newsrooms today don't even have functioning editorial boards. So that's part of some of the advocacy, some of the things that need to be changed in the media. Bring neutral people that are not the owners of the newspaper. Neutral people, people who are thoughtful people, philosophers, to that from time to time sit down to say, look at all the things that we have been talking about. If there are extraordinary things we want to publish, let's call an emergency meeting of the editorial board. Let's reflect on it, whether or not it should go out. When you have editors' meetings, these are the things to bring up at editors' meetings, to weigh the merits and demerits of whether or not to tell a story. Again, I go back to the point of it's not an individual sport, it's a team sport. And when there are people, when there are people who, I don't want to mention his name, but he's very popular on Twitter, who, basically just, think of themselves as, very solo independent journalists and just go on with their perspective of something and weave stories about it. That's not journalism, that's storytelling. Journalism is a team sport. And sometimes that thinking of it as a team sport also protects you, because there are certain stories that if you tell, you will get in trouble. But if you are able to get 10 newsrooms to collaboratively say, we're going to publish this thing together, channels, Arise, Cable News, ICIR, Daily Trust, Vanguard, all of us, we are going to publish this thing at exactly the same time. such that nobody knows who exactly told the story, you can't come and arrest all of us. If it's only me, it's easy to break me. I'm like a broomstick. I'm easy to break. But if it's a whole broom, a bunch of broom, it's hard to break. And it's important, especially when things get sensitive, that we think of it as a team sport. The second point, to your second question, to what extent is journalism value neutral, and to what extent does a journalist have to always be neutral and avoid stating his opinions? I think to the very short answer to your question is that journalism is not value neutral. You have an opinion, and you should be free to say your opinion, whatever it is. There's no reason to prevaricate. There's no reason to hedge. There's no reason to hedge. When you have an opinion, say your opinion. But it's important to also say where your opinion is coming from, so that people know when you are stating facts and when you are stating your opinion. But not to have an opinion and to pretend like you don't have an opinion is not necessarily good journalism. It's important to, be transparent about what your opinion is and what your perspective is that you are coming at a story with. But it's also important to also seek, alternative opinions when those alternative opinions, align with facts. There's no point seeking alternative opinion when the alternative opinion is misinformation. So we saw a lot of cases where a very good example of this is where, let's say, for example, there's a child molestation case, and then we then say that, oh, we want to go seek the opinion of people who endorse child molestation, and yes, maybe you can say that the culture of that place, there's a culture around that promotes that okays child molestation. Maybe you can say that, but you can't necessarily give that particular line of reasoning that is clearly factually wrong. You can't give it strength. I think we had a lot of cases like this during COVID, especially where vaccines are concerned, where the media then feels like, okay, we have to say that, we have to give the opinion of the anti-vaxxers. Yes, opinion of anti-vaxxers may be useful, but if it amounts to scaring people from taking a vaccine that has 99% success rate, then do you really have to do that? So there's always a challenge of whether or not you want to give voice to a fringe opinion or not. But the summary of what I'm saying is that when you have an opinion, you have an opinion, but be transparent about what your opinion is.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Amadine, I hope your question has been answered.
Yeah, but can I just the first question, I just wanted to know, when you mentioned that the editorial board and all that in the newsroom, I was just wondering, can you give an instance of perhaps an alternative that could be taken? You have the information already. Is it just to decide whether it will go or not, or is there an avenue where you decide what are we going to do with it? If not, expose it, how can we fix it, so to speak?
So again, I think, just to clarify what I said, I think you've got to weigh the pros and the cons of what you want to expose. If you expose a certain information, say you expose some information that reveals the hideouts or the where the arms of where military keep their arms. Of course, they will. NSA will come and arrest you. So you've got to weigh the pros and cons of what you want to release. But if what you're releasing is that someone in the army was corrupt and stole $1 billion, or stole arms and that was supposed to be used to fight Boko Haram, you are doing more harm by not releasing that story than you are by releasing the story. So it's really by the principle of what does the most harm, releasing the story or not releasing the story, that you go ahead to decide whether or not to publish a story. But again, the point I was making is that don't make that decision alone, because oftentimes we are biased. We are systematically biased. All of us are systematically biased. And which is why the wisdom of many, especially in cases that are sensitive, is always better than the wisdom of one person.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Journalism as a team sport, doesn't it make it easier for a few persons to manipulate what information goes out and which does not? I think that if there are more people, especially more people, if there is pluralism and especially more people with diverse opinions, work together to decide something, it's more likely that, that it's the same way universities, the academic system uses the peer review method, where, after one person has written something, you put it out there and you have your peers review it before it goes out, because that peer review process, it provides a basic gatekeeping of what goes out. And gatekeeping is not always correct. It won't always be correct, but at least we made an effort to not just release the first thoughts that came to our mind. At least we made an effort to make sure that things are accurate, to make sure that things are humane, to make sure that things are fair, and that it's objective, and that you've heard all the sides, and you're not vilifying someone without hearing their own side of the story. And that's really what it is. So yes, you can have you can have you have disinformation factories, like I said. So you can have disinformation factories where lots of people are working together to manipulate information. But that's not what we are talking about here. What we're talking about is how do we create gatekeeping processes that ensure that if there is a mistake of judgment or of content, it is caught before we release a story, we release something. And that's really what we're talking about here when we say it's a team sport. Okay. Are we still together? One major thing I've noticed in the media space in Nigeria is a situation where investigative reports are not usually followed through. A news breaks out on a Monday, and by Friday, we have moved on because the story was not followed through by the media. 100%. 100%. It's very true. It's very true. I think we were looking at, all the stories that we published sometime last year, and the results on whether or not you were accomplished. A very good example was the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. You saw in many countries where people who were indicted in those papers, faced, jail time and were prosecuted. In Nigeria, we wrote the most stories than any other country from Paradise and Panama Papers. But Nigeria was where nothing happened. Nothing happened to anybody that was indicted. But yes, part of it is that we don't follow up and write follow-up stories and go on and on to see how that ends. And there are a few reasons why that's the case. So one reason may be that oftentimes after you've written the first story, the journalist has moved on to his next story and is not paying attention to that story. The other reason is that after a journalist has written a story, it is not often their job when they move on. Sometimes they've passed on the baton to civil society and the citizens to take it up from there. And it's really up to the citizens and the legal system and the judicial system, to take it from there and to do the investigation. So we recently wrote a story in Dubai about a herbal medicine called Baba Aisha that is sold a lot in Southwest Nigeria. And that thing is killing people, but they keep selling it as cure for everything, that it can cure weak erection, it can cure cancer, it can cure everything. And we commissioned the story, did lab tests of the product and everything, and we wrote the report, and it was very damaging. And today, the NAFDAC took it up, banned thing, the police took it up, the man has been arrested, the thing has been confiscated. So there are isolated cases, especially when political people are not involved, that we get to a resolution. But oftentimes when a politician involved, politicians tend to be very powerful, especially the executive. They can basically, between bribing journalists to using, some other sort of by barter, they sometimes get, flop stories from not being written and things not being acted upon. So I think it's not just a Nigerian problem, it's an international problem. And it's a challenge that the media has to grapple with. You're right. It's a challenge we have to continue to grapple with.
Okay, we don't have any more questions at the moment. Thank you very much,
Right.
sir.
In that case, thanks everyone for your attention. I've enjoyed this and I've enjoyed the questions that you asked. It really shows that people are really thinking about the issue and about how to strengthen our media and by extension our democracy. So thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you very much, sir.
Dr. Toby, always a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure mine, man.
Okay, so the students, can you just show your appreciation to our facilitator before we call it an evening?
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you,
sir.
sir.
Thank
We are grateful. We appreciate.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
sir.
All right then.
Okay, so on behalf of the Electoral College, thank you once more, sir. And well done, everybody. Thanks to everyone that joined. Well done, Chalia. So classes continue tomorrow evening. So make it a date.